Okay, welcome to the Guitar Show. We're going to be talking today about the death of rock and roll. Now, actually, I want to firstly mention that Rick Beato, the great music YouTuber guy, great guy, he's actually released a video which is similar title, but I haven't actually watched it. The reason is because I wanted to do my own one first, try and keep it original. And also, he's an American, obviously, so he's doing it from an American point of view. So I'm obviously an Englishman, and I'm doing it from an Englishman's point of view. So it might be interesting. Hope so. So anyway, let's start. Let's start with the Rolling Stones in the 1960s. So the Rolling Stones in the 1960s were seen as this kind of like the rough diamonds compared to the Beatles. You know, the Beatles were kind of like everybody's favourite. You know, everybody's mum and dad would love the Beatles. They released the Christmas albums, and you'd sit by the fire listening to the Beatles. You know, although they started to have a little bit of an edge around Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album. Nonetheless, the Rolling Stones were seen as dangerous. You know, they got busted for drugs. You know, they were in the newspapers, and they were sort of shown as a bad example of, you know, how, you know, your children could possibly turn out if you're not careful. So that was kind of the rebellious nature of rock and roll. And rock and roll's always had that. It's always had this kind of rebellious thing where the parents don't identify with their kids' musical tastes, you know, and you know, and it's a way for kids to kind of, when they get to you know, 17, 18, 19, they want to rebel, they want to have something unique, they want to, you know, just test the waters and be a bit crazy, you know. It's just natural, you know, and this happened in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s with David Bowie, you know, and he's kind of cross-dressing and his different personas. Obviously it happened in the 80s with, also late 70s, 80s with Sex Pistols and the Ramones, obviously in America, but in England it was kind of like the Sex Pistols, and then you had New Wave, you know, and then kind of punk, New Wave, and then you had obviously the sort of 80s rock, and then it kind of like started to get a bit kind of bloated around the sort of 80s with Phil Collins, obviously, Sting, who was really cool in the Police. He was kind of quite edgy in the Police, but by the sort of late 80s, Sting had become, you know, more kind of like elevator music. You know, I love Sting. I'm going to be the first person to tell you I love every Sting album. He's a brilliant musician, but his music was becoming kind of like a bit Muzak, a bit elevator. And bands like Dire Straits, whom I really sort of loved. The thing I loved about Dire Straits, and we have to do a whole video on Dire Straits, you know. The thing I loved about Dire Straits was when they first appeared, they took a little bit of that punk kind of mentality and new wave. Now, I don't mean they sounded like the Sex Pistols, because obviously they didn't. Like Knopfler, amazing guitarist. David Knopfler was a great sort of Bruce Welch from the Shadows style rhythm guitar player, which we hadn't seen for many years. Pig Withers was brilliant on the drums, you know, really cool drummer, tight, you know, and obviously John Isley, great bass player. So you had Dire Straits produce Down to the River, I think it was called, and then Communique, these two really cool albums, very stripped, sparse. And with the punk attitude, I kind of meant that it was kind of stripped back, it didn't sound heavily produced, you know. So by 1991, Dire Straits made an album called Calling Elvis. No, sorry, it wasn't called Calling Elvis, that was a single. It was called On Every Street. So that album there had now become really polished. They had, you know, a huge band. You know, they had a huge entourage when they went on tour. I mean, I love that album. I thought it was an amazing. I got it when it came out in 1991. I was only a teenager, and I loved it. I thought it was so cool. But it wasn't. It's not kind of rebellious in any shape or form. It had become this big bloated sort of production sound, you know. And that's when Nirvana suddenly appeared, and Nirvana kind of blew all these old, sort of the older rock bands. When I say old, they were probably in their, you know, late 30s. You know, so it's not really sort of old for me now, but. You know, Nirvana came along, just blew everyone out of the water. All the sort of hair metal bands, if you were into sort of I don't know what they were called. I can't remember the hair metal bands with the big, spandex and all this stuff. They, Nirvana just obliterated all them. Like, yeah, for example, Def Leppard. Def Leppard, great band. Again, really heavily overproduced albums such as Hysteria, which was an incredible album, amazing album. But again, took them 2 years, whereas Nirvana came along, cut their album in a few days, and it was a total kind of punk ethos again. And then you had these great. So when I grew up, I was listening to Soundgarden, I was listening to Stone Temple Pilots, I was listening to Pearl Jam, and obviously Nirvana, and all these cool bands. I was skating, so for me it was great listening to these cool bands. And then obviously you had Guns N' Roses, and Guns N' Roses, although they came from what we call the Strip in LA, and all those kind of bar bands, they really had a bit of that punk and they were very edgy. And so if you're talking 1991, picture this, 1991, you've got this amazing bands. You've got music literally in every pub in England. Well, at least in my town, all over East Anglia where I was living, there were bands in every single pub. There was no, what we have in England now, we have Sky Sports, where you go to watch football in a pub. We didn't have that. In 1991 there was no Sky Sports. You could smoke. Now there's a smoking ban, but in 1991 you could smoke. So you would literally go out on a Friday or Saturday night in England, and there would be a band in every single pub. If there wasn't a band, you wouldn't go. So it's one thing I feel sorry about young musicians nowadays is, there's not many bands in pubs. Well, not compared to when I was young. There was bands in every pub. It was an amazing time to be a young musician. So, picture the scene. Guns N' Roses just sort of arrived in 1991. Every young guy wanted to be Axl Rose or Slash, and it was just an amazing time. Around 1994, though, it started to go wrong with, obviously, the story with Guns N' Roses. People left. I think in 96 or 7, Slash actually left Guns N' Roses. But for that period, they were kind of gods walking the earth. They were just huge bands. People were obsessed with Guns N' Roses. And then you had Metallica, who was another great band with the Black Album. Again, a huge rock album, amazing rock album. Foo Fighters, I think they formed after Kurt Cobain had died, obviously. I think they formed in 94, 95, 96. So they were kind of a rock and roll band that kind of came out of that whole movement because of, unfortunately, Kurt Cobain's demise. A lot of my friends were into English bands, and not necessarily bands like Nirvana, Metallica and Guns N' Roses and Soundgarden and all those sort of Seattle bands. The bands really that kind of made a big impression in the 90s and before the 90s was the Smiths, obviously with a great guitar player, Johnny Marr on guitar, is an incredible guitar player. My personal favourite band around that time was the Lars. The Lars actually released their album, I think they released it in around 1990. So this kind of year, 1990, was a really important year for rock and roll. So in 1990, the Lars album was, you might recall the song There She Goes, but that's a killer album. If you haven't heard it, just check that album out, called The Lars. Then you had the Stone Roses. And the Stone Roses, I think around 1990, again, great guitar player by the name of Chris Squire, they did a famous gig. Americans may not know this, my American viewers, but English, you British viewers will know this. They did a really important gig in sort of British rock and roll called the Spike Island Festival, and I think it was just a one-off gig and the only band that played was Stone Roses, and I think it almost was a free concert. Or they wanted to charge, but everybody just came in for free, and apparently everybody was on LSD or ecstasy or smoking hash. So it was kind of one of those landmark, legendary gigs, sort of like the Isle of Wight, I guess. And at that concert, at that actual concert, Noel Gallagher went there, and apparently he got the idea to form the band Oasis from that concert. So that's how kind of inspiring that gig was. So if you don't know the Stone Roses, then I'd suggest go and check out the guitar work of Chris Squire. And actually I've got a good friend that played with the Stone Roses called Aziz Ibrahim. And I'm going to ask Aziz actually on this guitar show, and hopefully we'll be able to do an interview with him pretty soon. So yeah, Stone Roses is a legendary rock and roll British band around that time in the early 90s. Then you, of course, you had Oasis, who came out also around that time. And I think it was sort of a little bit later, maybe 93, 94, when they really hit big in the mainstream. And they just got the whole country listening to music again. It almost created a movement, you know, whether you were a musician or not. You know, you had to. I remember reading guitar magazines around that time, and you'd open the front page, and you know, Oasis would be there, and I'd be like, at the end of the day, I'm more into Dire Straits and Peter Green, but you know, I've got to respect, you know, Noel Gallagher, you know, because and Liam Gallagher, because they're out there playing guitars. And there was a guitarist called Bonehead who played like an Antoria guitar, you know, and Noel Gallagher played Epiphone guitars, which were really cheap, seen as cheap guitars, you know, and they just, you know, they just had this really, really cool sound, and they had this cool image, and they were rebellious. So a lot of parents didn't like them, you know, some people didn't like, they frowned upon them because, you know, they were seen as kind of edgy. Even the Beatles, you know, Paul McCartney, I think, maybe in the end he liked them, but I remember George Harrison not liking them, and them saying in the press they didn't like this band. So they kind of had that kind of edginess. So in the end they kind of did a gig in 1996, which was called the Nebworth gigs, you know, such as Led Zeppelin had played Nebworth a few years before, quite a few years before I think. But anyway, they did this gig at Nebworth, and it was completely jam-packed. It was one of the biggest gigs ever, I think, on record for a single sort of rock band. And you know, it kind of, that's where they peaked. The band kind of peaked, and after that, you know, the sort of the albums they made weren't as good. The audience died down, and then you had social media suddenly come. I think 1998 or 1997, the next year after that gig, was the first year of social media. Some app was invented for social media. So it was never really quite the same, because, you know, you got to think, in 1996 there was no Facebook, there was no YouTube. So bands and music were really, really much more important, in my opinion, than it kind of is now, in the sense of a community. You know, people would go to gigs, you know, you'd be part of something, you'd connect with other people that would be into the gig. You know, people wouldn't be holding a mobile phone up to record the gig, you know. They wouldn't be taking selfies and sharing it on social media. There wasn't any of that. It was just literally, you went to the gig, you got into the music, and you know, it was the experience of it, of rock and roll. And again, there was this like mass movement. It was kind of almost a shocking thing when a new band broke through, and you know, Top of the Pops. You know, when people watched Top of the Pops, everybody in the country knew what was number one. You know, now I don't even know if Top of the Pops is going. I don't even know what the charts. Is there a chance? You know, do you tell me? You know, so I think it was a different era. I'm not saying it's better. I don't want to be nostalgic, but for me, that was the last great sort of rock and roll event. And band was, for me, was Oasis. After that, it will become derivative. You know, there was kind of bands, but they were kind of more sort of harking back to other bands, almost like tribute bands, and it was more about entertainment and dancers. You know, you had a singer and some backing dancers. You know, there wasn't guys singing with guitars with the same kind of gusto, you know, and the same passion as all those kind of Guns N' Roses and Nirvanas and Oasis. You know, so really for me, Oasis really was the last great rock and roll band, and that was kind of the end of rock and roll as we know it. And I don't think that period, for better or worse, will ever be captured again, because of social media, you know, and there's nothing wrong with social media. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I just think that was, you know, up till then, rock and roll was a very special kind of thing that kind of brought people together. Maybe Facebook now brings that together. In England also, just a few points, we had a law came in. A bit of controversy here. The law actually was passed by the guy that owned Sky Sports, because he wanted to get Sky Sports, like this big football TVs, into pubs, and he wanted to kick out the bands. And that's actually what happened. You know, you needed a license to have a band, so then pubs wouldn't want drummers and bands anymore. They just wanted duos, you know, like a guitarist and a karaoke thing, or a DJ. You know, so lots of things happened, and the smoking ban happened in 2006 in Great Britain, that, you know, killed off a lot of the bands. So that whole kind of band movement, that rock and roll, you know, that you'd be doing gigs in pubs, you know, and then you progress and progress, that kind of died a bit, you know, and it's not the same now. It's sort of bands tend to happen on YouTube and Facebook, social media, and they do showcase gigs in London, and it's slightly different, you know, it's a different vibe now. So again, I don't want to be nostalgic, I don't want to be the old fogey saying, you know, it was better in my day, you know, but for me personally, rock and roll died at that Nebworth gig. There was nothing really as good as that period, you know. Even the bands like Dire Straits, even though they'd become bloated and over commercialised, it was still rock and roll. It was still a great rock gig, you know. I know you have the Foo Fighters now. I think the Foo Fighters were actually formed in '94, so you know that would still adhere to my theory about rock and roll dying in '96. I mean, I know Foo Fighters became big after that, but really, since that kind of period, there's been nothing really as big and that's grabbed the nation. And you know, I think now after that, it became about DJs and hip hop and rap and a different vibe. You know, you have bands like I said, like Coldplay, which were kind of, you know, sort of more in the line of a Jeff Buckley sort of style music, you know. So let me know your thoughts. This is a bit of it's not really a rant, it's just more of a theory of mine. And it's interesting to get your views if you think rock and roll is alive and well, which it is. You know, rock and roll hasn't died, but I think the rock and roll, you know, there will never be another, you know, Oasis. There will never be another Guns N' Roses. In my opinion, you know, it won't. You know, there will never be another Nirvana. I think you know, Foo Fighters have come close. You know, they've come close to those bands, but I think not where all of, you know, you grow up. You know, you're teenagers and you grow up and there's a scene, you know, there's a rock and roll scene and everybody is into that scene. I don't think that's going to happen again, you know. Maybe commercially and financially they're making the same money, but I'm speaking more on a social sort of level with sort of the young youth people. I haven't seen that happen like it did in up to '96. So that's my theory. Let me know what you think, guys and girls, and speak soon. Take care.